Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part of my four-part series then on what I'm calling the Daedalus Complex. And today's installment will be on Fernando Pessoa's, the Portuguese writer, Fernando Pessoa's masterpiece, the Book of Disquiet, which I will not hesitate to tell you I've written an award-winning book, well, award-winning in the sense that it did receive a citation as an outstanding title from the American Library Association. It's published by Dalkey Archive Press, need I say more? And I think it's a very readable book about Pessoa's unwritten novel. He says at one point, Bernardo Soares, the narrator, I feel like a character in an unwritten novel, and that's where I got the idea for the title of the book. Anyway, more about Pessoa in a few minutes, or maybe more than a few minutes. I plan to say a couple of words, but which may become more than a couple of words, about the idea of the Daedalus Complex itself. Even those of you who've never heard of such a thing as the Daedalus Complex will certainly have heard of the Oedipus Complex, a coinage that was made very famous by Sigmund Freud, upon whose shoulders I'm standing, as it were, in inventing this term, the Daedalus Complex. Remembering that the Oedipus Complex involves a triangular relationship. You have the mother, the father, the son, and the tensions that develop, the conflicts that develop, the transgressions in fact, that develop among the three. So the son wants to kill the father, sleep with the mother, and so on. Very, very tension-ridden, very transgressive series of relationships. And Freud calls it the Oedipus Complex because he finds the classical expression of these interdicted desires, as it were, in Sophocles' classic play, Oedipus the King, and in which, in his own essay, he calls attention to the passage in Oedipus where Oedipus says, oh, the oracle said I was going to kill my father and marry my mother, whatever it is. And she says, oh, don't worry about it. You only did, or you would have only done, what every man desires to do. And that Freud saw in that then an underlying desire to violate very foundational, let's say, very foundational taboos upon which any civilized society will necessarily be created. Okay, my idea of the Daedalus Complex then comes obviously not from Sophocles' play, but rather from Ovid's comic epic Metamorphoses, and in particular the ninth book of Metamorphoses then, which tells the story of Daedalus, the archetypal artist, creating the labyrinth and then also fashioning the wings with which he and his son Icarus will presumably escape from the labyrinth in which they've been imprisoned by Minos, by the king. And the passage that I have in mind then is not, to be sure, forgetting Oedipus, is the passage in which Ovid, the Roman poet then, the author of Metamorphoses, describes the building of the labyrinth under the command of Minos, the king. Just a few lines, and it reads, Minos determined to remove the cause of this opprobrium. The opprobrium, by the way, it's that his wife Pasiphae made love with a bull, had intercourse with a bull, with the help of Daedalus, to be sure, who created a cow that she could put herself into and that would facilitate intercourse with the bull The result then was the minotaur, half human, half bull, and that's described then and referred to here as an opprobrium. It's a kind of vermin, it's something really horrible against which one has to be protected. So Minos determined to remove the cause of this opprobrium from his abode, enclosing it within a labyrinth devised and built by Daedalus, the most distinguished of all living architects, who framed confusion and seduced the eye into a maze of wandering passages. So the Daedalus complex, then, not someone, Daedalus, then, the figure of Daedalus, not someone who's being punished in this particular case, then, because, as with Oedipus, because of his violation of taboos, but rather because he's the most distinguished, the greatest of all architects. And it is that idea, what I have in mind then throughout the project that I'm working on, is the idea of writers creating these architectural works in the literary monuments, as it were, that they create. But literary monuments, they perfect these monuments which they create then necessarily in order to create the monument, they have to find a victim. They have to find someone to put into the labyrinth, which of course the Minotaur, a role that the Minotaur serves very well indeed. I also, I do mention in an earlier installment of this four-part series, and maybe I'll say something about it really, really quickly, another way in which the Daedalus complex works, and in relation to Ovid's Metamorphoses, is that you have to read to the very end of Metamorphoses, the hundreds of pages, either that or you turn right away to the very end after you've read Book IX, reread the part about Daedalus and Icarus, go to the epilogue on the very last page. It's only about 10 lines or so, in which Ovid talks about not his own journey, his own skyward flight. He's not flying up to the sun. He's not moving too close to the sun, in which case the wax on his wings would melt and he would fall into the sea, as Icarus does, but rather he's going to fly even above the stars, and he's going to be immortalized. Not he personally, not in his physical self, but rather what he calls the better part of me, or the greater part of me, perhaps. In other words, the work itself, the poem that he's written. So it's rather interesting when you think that Daedalus in the classical period, to be sure, was the archetypal figure of the artist. And remember James Joyce, in his modernist novel, 20th Century, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the figure of the character of the artist, the protagonist in that novel, is named Stephen Daedalus. And so in Ovid, as also in Joyce in a way, Joyce's novel, in Metamorphoses, Daedalus is there kind of literally in Book IX of Metamorphoses, the literal figure of Daedalus as the archetypal artist, the visible embodiment of the artist. But also throughout Metamorphoses, we should also take into account or be aware of the presence of the invisible artist, who is Ovid himself, who's constructing the poem, and in that way the poem itself becoming the wings, as it were, through which he will fly even above the stars, even above all those constellations that are up there in the sky. I suppose the most obvious example, I don't use it in this series of lectures, there are other, I do have, maybe I'll mention it right now then, I do have a lecture, rather extended one, on F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. It's called Plagiarism Unbound, Borrowing Desire in The Great Gatsby. It begins with a little vignette, because my wife showed up late to the talk, and I'm trying to find something to talk about while waiting for her. And I do mention a little anecdote about growing up in the working class in Newport, Rhode Island, which is my own background, which is rather interesting. It kind of has a bearing on the relationship between Gatsby and all those meretriciously rich people. Anyway, but to talk a bit more seriously, you know, it's interesting in The Great Gatsby that Fitzgerald and Nick Carraway, through Nick Carraway, then makes Gatsby out to be this larger-than-life figure. It was his romantic readiness. He was, had to be about. He was a son of God. Was that he had to be about his father's business? And Nick Carraway writes all these really grandiloquent reflections for Gatsby. Gatsby said, "Oh, the sidewalk, it turned into a ladder, and if I could climb up the ladder above the tree and suck on the incomparable milk of wonder." He says, "Oh, Gatsby would never. He would not get caught dead talking like that." Anyways, all of these ways in which Fitzgerald builds Gatsby up as much as he possibly can, and then creates the fall, makes the fall, then makes of him the victim who will be entombed like the Minotaur, or who will fall into the sea. Remember, like at Icarus, Gatsby's out there in his swimming pool, floating on his little raft there, whatever it is, his float. Okay, so that there are a number of ways at the end of The Great Gatsby that suddenly there's this reversal. Gatsby in the Plaza Hotel scene where Tom Buchanan says, "You're Mr. Nobody from nowhere," is not a lie by any means. It certainly is a realistic, a plausible way of looking at Gatsby. Even more tellingly than that, even more damning than that, is when Daisy says to him, "I loved you always. I loved you always," which is, that just really destroys him to think that she also loved, that he was only, one among who knows how many. He's killed by George Wilson. What's more embarrassing? If you're supposed to be a great heroic figure, you're out there floating in your swimming pool, and this garage mechanic comes along and shoots you, kills you. Nick Carraway refers to it as a Holocaust, as though that's, which it's not at all, but there is a kind of Holocaust at the end, in the next chapter, where no one shows up except Owl Eyes. No one among the people who were there, the various parties that Gatsby threw. Owl Eyes is the only one who shows up. Maya Woolsham doesn't. Of course, Tom and Daisy don't, and so on. So there are multiple ways. Have I named about 5 different ways in which Fitzgerald, knowing that if he just lets Gatsby disappear into the sunset, go off in the sunset, well, he has not written a novel that people are going to be reading 100 years later. He has to do the most utterly devastating things to Gatsby, get him killed, and in that way then make of him the perfect victim that will be entombed, as it were, immured, would be in the walls, as it were, of the masterpiece of perhaps the great American novel, if you will, that he's written. I just want to say, just for a moment, I was thinking when the word immured came to mind. I have written this other book, if I can get it. There we go, called The Seance of Reading. Some of you, Uncanny Designs in Modernist Writing, some of you may recognize the photo on the cover. It's from Samuel Beckett's very late play, or quite extraordinary play, called Ohio Impromptu. Ohio Impromptu, referring to the state of Ohio, and a play which had its world premiere in Columbus, Ohio, which I attended in the, must have been, it was the early 1980s, so quite a long time ago, but a quite fascinating play. Anyway, I mention it because, because it's my book, and it's an interesting one. It was published in Romania, so readily available in Romania. Whether you can get it outside of Romania, I really don't know. I think of it very much as my Made in Romania book, and whether, what is it, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Maybe what is a book that's published in Romania is made to stay in Romania, in which case I'd be very, very happy. My relationship with Romania, with Romanian universities and professors and students, being the very, very happy occasion which it has been. My reason for mentioning it very quickly is that this book is based on, I had this project which had been calling the Daedalus Complex for a very, very long time, and that I learned when I was teaching and lecturing in Romania, that I learned about a Romanian legend translated into English called the Legend of Master Manole. Manole being a master builder who's building a monastery, and he learns what I don't want to go into too many details, but it ends up that he has to immure. Remember, I'd used the word immure a little while ago, the idea that Gatsby is immured in the Great Gatsby, that Manole learns that he has to immure his living wife, and he can't sacrifice and then bury immure her corpse. She has to be immured alive in the walls of the monastery in order for the monastery to be successfully completed. And that's very much the idea. Was the idea of the Daedalus Complex, which I then translated into or transferred into the Manole Complex, so I have a whole bunch of modernist works that I interpreted, which I reveal the underlying presence of what Mircea Eliade, the Romanian philosopher, then calls archaic building rituals, that in order for the writer, in order for him to build, to make his construction, his architectural monument, he has to sacrifice, he has to immure. Going on from there, I talked about, beginning with Metamorphoses, I then, in an earlier installment of this series, talked about Dante's Inferno, and in particular, Canto XXVI of Inferno. That's where the journey of Ulysses. So we have Daedalus flying off, Ulysses in Metamorphoses, Book IX, in Canto XXVI of Inferno. The Daedalus figure returns in the form of Ulysses, who goes off on a journey and who speaks very eloquently to his men who come along with him, who don't give up, who fare forward and so on, and of course who go to their doom. They drown as Icarus had drowned before them. And then the way in which Dante immures, if you will, Ulysses in his Inferno, and the Inferno itself then being an account in which Dante undertakes a journey that parallels Ulysses' journey. Remember, Ulysses wanted to go to a place that no man has ever seen. Well, Dante does go down into the underworld, into which no living person has ever entered. There's much more to go on about, but I don't want to. I'd rather, but just for the moment, to draw attention again to that uncanny, that ambiguous, ambivalent perhaps relationship between the protagonist who does something that gets him into a whole lot of trouble, that leads to a catastrophe for him, and then at the same time the idea of the writer doing something rather similar, but leading to a very, very different kind of conclusion. From there, I go on it's in the second or the third, I guess, installment where I talk about Shakespeare's Hamlet, and they're using the idea that there's one of the editors, and it's of the Oxford edition of Shakespeare's Hamlet, a man named Gatsby, who talks about Shakespeare being possessed of a demon as he writes Hamlet, that just the frenzy that you feel, the joy that you feel Shakespeare having taken while he was writing the play, and while he's really creating a number of catastrophes, not only for Hamlet, but for just about every character in the play, and then relating that to Hamlet's madness, or to the madness which is induced in him by the demon that appears to him in the first act of the play in the form of the ghost of his father, the way in which the uncanny relationship, then the mirroring relationship between Hamlet's demonic possession, if you will, the visible demonic possession, and then the invisible possession that leads to Shakespeare creating this very, very carefully, very intricately constructed play. Hamlet's behavior seems very, very bizarre. He goes this way, that way, and he just seems to be a person possessed with no particular direction, something very, very haphazard, very zigzag about his movements, which is true. But when you look at it from a distance, you see that the play itself is not by any means haphazard, but is constructed in the form of a chiasm. I go into this in great detail. If any of you are interested, just get in touch with me and I'll send you the diagram that I have. I should get along. The one other example before I start talking about Pessoa. How long have I been talking already? Oh my God, 20 minutes, okay. I'll try to make this quick. That the next example makes a very nice transition, is between Hamlet and modern literature. That it is T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, because Prufrock, of course, refers to Hamlet not only explicitly, I am not Prince Hamlet, or was meant to be, am an attendant lord, and then it goes on from there towards the end of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And there are other ways too, and I'm not going to go into them, in which Hamlet is alluded to. What I will simply point out is that the way in which, say, the voice, let me put it this way, the voices of other people are a hindrance for Prufrock. His hair is thinning. They'll say how his arms and legs are thin, and so on. Do I dare to eat a peach? Shall I part my hair behind? And so on. I shall roll my trousers, as all of this. Well, how I'm looking to other people, what they're going to say about me. Well, and that's visibly then, it's very clear that Prufrock is impeded, let's say, by the voices of other people. Eliot, in his very famous essay, what used to be a famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, talks about the voices for a writer, the voices of other writers, of his dead ancestors, and all the things. He uses voices metaphorically. What he means is all the words that were written by Shakespeare, by Dante, by Andrew Marvell, by Charles Baudelaire, by you name it, any of the many, many writers, authors of the various books of the Bible, to be sure, whose words turn up at times in very disguised, at other times very, very, very obvious ways. Had we but willed enough in time, and rolling the universe into a ball, and so on. Andrew Marvell, we get. So the voices that Eliot hears are voices that lead him to this achievement, which is the poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, unlike Prufrock himself, who drowns at the end. So you have you have Oedipus drowning, you have Ulysses drowning, you have the whole court of Denmark dead, at least laid out on the floor of the stage at the end of the play. And you have Prufrock, we linger by the chambers of the sea, you'll see till human voices wake us and we drown. So you have a whole series of protagonists who also serve as victims for the author, and victims upon whose victimage the author depends for his achievement. Okay, enough about those very few words, which have taken more than 20 minutes, but I hope has been a time that's been used usefully to give a broader, a more general picture of what it is that I'm working on. And again, you can always contact. It's a 3-volume project that I have in mind. This is the second book. The first of them is called Ritual Unbound. It was published by the University of Delaware Press quite a while ago. And the third volume, I'm beginning any time now. Okay, so looking at Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, we notice in the book itself, I don't have a copy of it. I would have held it up and shown you. You would have seen, you just open it, you see right away, it's in the form of fragments. And Pessoa never published it. He died when he was, 49 years old. He died in the French hospital in Lisbon. He was taken there in the night, and he wrote on a scrap of paper. He was trilingual, at least. He wrote in English, "I know not what tomorrow will bring." And he put the scrap of paper on the night table, and he died overnight. And quite wonderfully, the administration then of the French hospital, the Hôpital Saint-Louis, St. Louis Hospital in Lisbon, has put right at the entrance to the hospital, there's a gate there, and right at the end, there's a big plaque that says Hôpital Saint-Louis, and then below that, there's a smaller plaque, but quite prominent, bearing the words, "I know not what tomorrow will bring," Fernando Pessoa. Quite moving indeed to visit that particular shrine. Okay, so the book itself is in the form of fragments, but throughout the Book of Disquiet, as we're reading, we see scattered allusions to the 2 artifacts, the labyrinth and the wings, that had appeared, and that is so central, to be sure, and foregrounded. We don't have to go looking for them. They're foregrounded in Book IX of Metamorphoses. So the labyrinth and the wings, upon which Daedalus's reputation as the archetypal artist rests. Soares describes himself, for example, as lost in tangles, natural labyrinths of darkness, and as, another quotation, a will lost somewhere in the labyrinth of what I really am. And when he complains later on, everything becomes a confusing labyrinth where I stray in myself, away from myself. He also, the literal labyrinth in Metamorphoses in Book IX, constructed by Daedalus, becomes a metaphorical, a subjective labyrinth in the Book of Disquiet. He also refers to the meandering pages of his writing. And as some of you may know, in Book IX, the labyrinth is described as being like the river Meander, the river that has that name, Meander, which meanders around. The labyrinth meanders as the river meandered. So Pessoa, referring to the meandering pages of his writing, and describes his putting his impressions in vagabond words that desert me as soon as they're written, wandering on their own over slopes and meadows of images, along avenues of concepts, down footpaths of confusions. It's an astonishing work, but which I won't pause over for too long. Okay, images of flight. So we've got the labyrinth to begin with. Images of flight include his telling us that I spread my wings without moving, like an imaginary condor. His looking at the immense sky and the countless stars, and I'm free with a winged splendor whose fluttering sends a shiver throughout my body. And then a little later, he talks about the lofty clear sky where I see an impalpable soft down of a winged and faraway life. The Daedalus, whose display of artistic skill contrasts with the suffering that is displaced upon his surrogate, however, disappears. His once godlike powers now demoted to the level of a daydreaming child. This is Soares, then. Bernardo Soares is the name of the narrator. He says, in my arranging and rearranging of images, I'm like a child using newspaper to dress up as a king. And in a way, I create rhythm with a series of words. I'm like a lunatic adorning my hair with dried flowers that are still alive in my dreams. Or he refers to himself as well as an interior decorator. He says, if life has given us no more than a prison cell, let us at least decorate it as best we can with the shadows of our dreams, their colorful patterns engraving our oblivions on the static surface of the walls. The disappearance in the book of an artist whose mastery of his medium sets him apart from the protagonist whom he otherwise resembles has as its principal consequence that Pessoa and Soares are, to adapt one of Soares's more startling images, Siamese twins that aren't attached. I love that line. We are Siamese twins that are not attached. Françoise Lay, French woman then who's written on, I'm trying to think, she translated Pessoa into French, refers to the author of the book as Pessoa Soares, a trait d'union, a hyphen between the two, as Pessoa Soares, and has this to say about their relationship. Soares, like Pessoa himself, wants to remain undefined, wavering in flight from the gaze of others, and refusing to sacrifice any of his virtualities, any of his possibilities for self-renewal. But there is even more to say about this. Bernardo Soares, that is Fernando Pessoa himself, thinks of himself as a stranger like any other poet, but to such an unusually extreme degree that includes all of humanity, whose mediocrity he deplores. Sorry, that is Françoise Lay. I'm quoting her, not the text. There is, to be sure, an even a close personal relationship, a resemblance between the two. As Robert Bresson reminds us, after his mother's death, Pessoa began leading a life that closely resembles Soares's. This is Bresson then. He went more and more often to the cafes of the Chiado, the Beixa, if that's how it's pronounced. I can't speak Portuguese. Like Soares, he was increasingly given over to the wandering about Lisbon, to flânerie, to dreaming, to alcohol, to little joys and great sorrows. That's in his Bresson's book, Étranger. Zbigniew Kotowicz adds this observation, Kotowicz, I guess it is, adds this observation that, in quotes, many of Soares's traits resemble Pessoa himself: loneliness, immobility, a meaningless office job are all a part of Pessoa's existence, stripping Soares of external accidents through an aesthetics of poverty, abnegation, decadence, and insignificance. Pessoa bears himself open. Soares's voice is sometimes what one imagines Pessoa would sound like in a confessional mood. This is the nearest we get to Pessoa's pain, to Pessoa at his most intimate. Pessoa himself adds support to this view when he remarks in his unfinished preface to what's called Fictions of the Interlude, his title. He says, "My semi-heteronym Bernardo Soares, who in many ways resembles Alvaro de Campos." Campos was one of his real... Pessoa wrote in the form of these various, what he called heteronyms. They were not pseudonyms. They were other identities that he took on. And I don't remember myself offhand. Is there a total of 60 of these heteronyms, of 60 or 70 of them, Alvaro de Campos being among the most famous of them? Pessoa said that Bernardo Soares was a semi-heteronym, that more like himself than his heteronyms, who were quite distinct from himself. He said that my semi-heteronym Bernardo Soares always appears when I'm sleepy or drowsy, so that my qualities of inhibition and rational thought are suspended. His prose is an endless reverie. He's a semi-heteronym because his personality, although not my own, doesn't differ from my own, but is a mere mutilation of it. He's me without my rationalism and emotions. His prose is the same as mine, except for certain formal restraint, that reason imposes on my own writing, and his Portuguese is exactly the same. I think maybe I'll stop there because I talk quite a lot in greater length than I originally intended about the idea of the Daedalus Complex, of the ambiguous relationship between the author and his protagonist, the aesthetic triumph that the author creates on the beginning with or originating in or depending upon the sacrifice of his protagonist, and the idea of the close relationship between the author, the creator and the creation, if you will, the author and the protagonist victim, but also the divergence between the two. And especially because, as I just quoted that line in which Pessoa suggests that Bernardo Soares is like him, but he's also his mutilated self. I think maybe to stop with that idea of, and I will say this though, that Pessoa did not have, this is what I'll end with. Pessoa did not have Soares in mind in his original conception of the Book of Disquiet. He wrote any number of fragments, and I don't have the details at my fingertips of for how long he was working on the Book of Disquiet before suddenly the idea, the brilliant idea of having Bernardo Soares as its narrator occurred to him. But and I don't have my volume with me, but in Richard Zenith's edition again, many of the fragments that he wrote at the outset, Zenith puts them in the appendix. There's a new edition, a more recent edition, what's his name? Fernando Pessoa did an edition which has then been translated into English, in which those fragments, the original fragments, are put at the beginning, and so you can get a chronological sense as you're reading, a sense of the development of the project of the Book of Disquiet, which again, Pessoa died before he had any, and before he was able to organize it into a coherent, into a completed work. But what's interesting is you notice, and whether you go to the end of Richard Zenith's or to the beginning of Pessoa's edition of the Book of Disquiet, you'll see the great difference in quality between those early fragments, which they're okay, but they're also rather forgettable. They don't contribute to the monumental achievement, which is the Book of Disquiet itself. Soares at one point describes himself as a building in ruins that was never anything more than ruins. And the Book of Disquiet indeed is a monumental ruin, as it were, a monument made of ruins. But it's not until he gets the idea of having these fragments narrated by his quote-unquote mutilated self, as Ovid tells the story of Daedalus' flight, making of Daedalus a mutilated version of himself, Shakespeare making Hamlet a mutilated, and for reasons that I don't quite go into here, but that of Hamlet as a mutilated version, and certainly of T.S. Eliot, Prufrock being very much like Eliot, but Eliot, Prufrock is a victim of what Eliot calls the Eliot way, but the Eliot way is also a source of great achievement. So Prufrock is a predestined failure on the one hand, but Eliot creates a great thing out of his failure. So also, it's only when a Prufrock-like figure, Bernardo Soares, comes to Pessoa's aid, as it were, and commits harakiri in the text. Not quite. I mean, not literally. That was probably not a good inspiration, the use of that image. But he's anyway. If you haven't read the, did I mention? Maybe not. But so the Book of Disquiet, in whatever version you read it, and I recommend Richard Zenith's, maybe not only because he's American and he's a really nice guy that we had dinner with in Lisbon several years ago, and also he wrote I forgot this reward. He wrote a really, really nice appreciation of my book. He says, really, really good book. And what I do want to say, if I forgot to say at the beginning, it's online. I put it on my academia.edu page. I think, did I see on Amazon, like you can buy it for $140, or it's $30-some on Kindle, I think. That was not my idea by any means, but it's free. It's free on the internet, the PDF. I put it up a few years ago on the internet. And if you're interested, just go, you do a Cousineau Pessoa. I mean, you're probably more adept at this sort of thing than I am. My grandchildren certainly are. So just go ahead and get the PDF of the book. Get Richard Zenith's, or there are other translations as well. And that's all for now. So thank you. If you have been listening, I'm very, very, very grateful indeed, and I hope that it's been an enjoyable and perhaps even enlightening experience for you. And with that, I shall say goodbye.